The town that emptied in a single night. A sleep story. Close your eyes now. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day lift away from you slowly, the way smoke lifts from a chimney on a still morning. There is nothing you need to do tonight, nowhere you need to be. Only this quiet voice, this unhurried road, this story that asks nothing of you except that you breathe and listen. We are going somewhere tonight, somewhere out west. Somewhere the land is wide and the sky is wider, and the stars hang so low on autumn evenings that you feel you could reach up and touch them with your fingertips if you only tried. It is 1888. The summer has been long and hot, and now September is threading itself into the desert air like cool ribbon. The cottonwood leaves have begun to yellow. The sage has deepened to a silvery gray. Somewhere in the hills of the Arizona Territory, a town is waiting. Its name is Hollow Creek. And if you have never heard of it, that is understandable. Most people haven't. It does not appear on the newer railroad maps. The stagecoach drivers know it only as a name they don't say after dark, and when you ask them why, they look down at their boots and change the subject to something safer. The weather, the price of beef, the merits of different axle grease. They do not say the name. Not after sunset. This is a rule they all seem to keep without ever having agreed upon it. But there was one man who heard the name and wrote it down in his small leather notebook, pressing the pencil carefully so the letters would last. His name was Elias Hartwell. He was not a young man exactly, but not yet old. Somewhere in his middle years, with a lean face weathered by years of traveling roads that most people had the good sense to avoid, and gray beginning to show at his temples like frost appearing early. He wore a good wool coat that had seen better decades. His boots were resoled twice. He carried a canvas saddlebag filled with notebooks, all of them full, their pages cramped with observations about old battlefields and failed settlements, and the traces that people leave behind when they move on. He was what the newspapers sometimes called an amateur historian, though he disliked the word amateur. He preferred the phrase careful observer. He had spent 12 years traveling the territories, documenting the places that time was swallowing. The abandoned forts, the collapsed mill towns, the settler camps that had flickered briefly and gone dark. He had written 3 small books that very few people had read. He didn't mind. He wrote for the same reason he traveled, because he believed that if no one remembered a place, it disappeared more completely than if it had never existed at all. He had heard about Hollow Creek from a stagecoach driver named Orville Pruitt. It was a September evening in Tucson at a boarding house table with a checked cloth and candles burning down to their last inch. Orville had been eating beef stew and talking about the route north, and he had mentioned the old mining road almost as an aside, the way you mention a sore tooth that you've learned to work around. He said there was a town on the road that nobody went to anymore. Said the road passed right through it, or used to, before they rerouted the mail line 3 years back. When Elias asked what had happened to the town, Orville set down his spoon. He looked at the candle for a moment. He said they left. All of them. One night in the summer of '83, the whole town got up and walked away, and nobody's ever been able to explain it properly. Elias wrote Hollow Creek in his notebook. He asked, was there a mine? There was, Orville said, silver. The Cassidy mine. They'd been pulling good ore out of it for years, and the town had built itself up around it. Maybe 400 souls at its peak, maybe more. A school, 2 saloons, a church with a real bell imported from Missouri, and then one June night, all of them gone. No bodies, no note, just gone. Elias asked if anyone had investigated. Orville picked his spoon back up. He said the sheriff from the next county came out, said he couldn't find nothing wrong, said it was probably just the mine running dry and folks moving on. But he said it too fast, Orville added, the way people say things when they don't want to look too close. That was all Elias needed. He finished his stew. He paid for his room. He lay on the narrow bed with his notebook open on his chest and stared at the ceiling until the candle burned down, and in the morning he hired a horse. The road north from Tucson was good for the first 20 miles. Packed dirt, well-traveled, marked by the ruts of supply wagons and the hoof prints of cattle drives. Then it narrowed. Then it became something that wanted very much to stop being a road at all and return to being desert. The hills rose around it, red and dusty, covered in chala cactus and scrub oak, and the occasional tall saguaro standing with its arms lifted in that way they have, patient and unhurried. Red-tailed hawks circled at distances so great they were barely specks. The sky was that particular blue that only exists in the Southwest in September. deep and pure and empty of clouds stretching to every horizon like a promise. Elias rode slowly. He was in no hurry. He had learned long ago that hurrying past a landscape was one of the better ways to misunderstand it. He kept his notebook open across his thigh as he rode, writing down what he observed. The soil color, the angle of the ridgelines, the direction of the creek bed, dry now but carved deep enough to suggest that in wet seasons it ran hard. Hollow Creek, the town, had presumably been named for this waterway. He found the creek bed about 8 miles from where the map said the town should be, and he followed it north through a narrow canyon where the walls were close enough that the morning sun still hadn't reached the floor. It was cooler in there. The horse's hooves sounded different, more careful, more considered, on the loose stones. Somewhere above him, a canyon wren was singing its descending spiral of a song over and over as if practicing. He emerged from the canyon onto a wide, flat shelf of land, and there was Hollow Creek. He stopped the horse. He sat very still in the saddle for a long moment, just looking. There are things you expect when you arrive at an abandoned town. You expect collapse. You expect the particular way that time undoes human work. The sagging roof lines, the broken windows, the weeds pushing through every crack. The sense that the land is methodically reclaiming what it was always only lending. You expect the melancholy of ruins, which is a softer kind of sadness, one that carries within it the knowledge of time's ordinary passage. Hollow Creek offered none of this. The buildings stood straight, not all of them. Here and there a porch had caved and one small structure near the creek had lost its roof entirely. But most of them, the main ones along what must have been the principal street, were entirely intact. The paint was faded, a few shutters hung crooked, but the walls were upright, the windows mostly unbroken, and the roof lines held their shapes against the sky without apology. A wooden sign at the edge of town still read, Hollow Creek, Arizona Territory, in letters that had once been black and were now a soft ash gray. One corner of the sign had warped slightly, lifting like the edge of a page. Elias rode in slowly. The main street was perhaps a quarter-mile long. He counted the buildings as he passed a general store with a false front and a hitching rail in front, a barber shop, what appeared to be a lawyer's office or a surveyor's judging by the faded lettering on the glass, a millinery shop, 2 saloons. He could tell them apart by their wider doors and the remnants of decorative woodwork above the entrances. A hotel with 3 stories and a covered veranda. A livery stable at the far end, its wide doors standing open. And then set back from the main street by a small square of packed dirt that had once been a yard of church, white painted or had been. A modest bell tower, and in the tower visible even from where he sat on his horse, a bronze bell. As he watched the September wind move through the canyon and up the street, and the bell shifted in its housing and let out a single low resonant tone. Not a full ring, not even half a ring, just the ghost of a sound. The brief suggestion of the bell's voice given and then taken back before it could become a statement. Elias dismounted. He tied his horse at the hitching rail in front of the general store. He stood in the middle of the street and turned slowly, looking. The curtains. That was the first thing that struck him once he stopped moving. Behind the windows of the buildings, curtains hung. White ones, yellow ones, one that had been blue and was now the color of old sky. They moved in the breeze that came through the open windows, and the broken panes swaying with the easy rhythm of curtains in an ordinary inhabited house. He walked to the general store. The door was unlocked, the latch lifted without resistance. Inside, the shelves still held goods. Tins of food, some of them rusted badly enough that he wouldn't trust the contents. Bolts of calico fabric, faded but intact. A row of glass apothecary jars with their painted labels, still legible cinnamon, whole pepper-dried lavender. A glass case that must have held tobacco and candy, now empty but unbroken. The scale on the counter still balanced perfectly when he set his hand on one tray. He moved back outside and across the street to the first of the homes. It was a small house. 2 rooms from the look of it, with a lean-to kitchen added to one side. The front door stood slightly ajar, which told him that no one had latched it from inside when they left. He pushed it open. The interior was dim, the windows giving just enough light to read by if you turned the pages toward them. A braided rug on the floor, its color still visible. Red and blue and a faded gold. A rocking chair positioned near the window as though someone had recently been sitting in it to catch the afternoon light. A small table with a kerosene lamp. In the kitchen, a cast-iron pot sat on the stove. He went to it. The food inside had long since gone to nothing. A dry, dark crust at the bottom, unidentifiable years removed from whatever it had once been. But the pot was still there. The ladle was still hung on its hook. Two tin cups sat on the table beside a wooden sugar bowl, their handles turned outward the way you'd arrange them if you expected someone to sit down. He put his hand on the surface of the stove. He held it there for a long moment. The iron was cold, of course. 5 years cold. But for just a second, just the smallest fraction of a second, he thought he felt something. He stood very still. He moved his hand away. He looked at the pot. He looked at the cups. He went back outside. He spent the rest of that afternoon moving slowly through the town making notes. He had learned over years of this work how to observe without disturbing, how to pass through a place the way a geologist passes through bedrock, reading the layers without breaking them. He didn't move furniture. He didn't open drawers. He made sketches in his notebook of the street layout, the position of each building, the angle at which things had been left. He found in the schoolhouse at the north end of town a slate board still bearing writing. The lesson that had been left on it, he could read most of it, though the chalk had faded, was a geography lesson. Capitals of the Western Territories: Phoenix, Salt Lake City. The list ended mid-column as though the teacher had turned from the board to address the class and simply never turned back. A row of small hooks on the wall inside the door still held a few items: a child's lunch pail, its bail handle rusted, a woolen scarf in a dusty red, a pair of small leather gloves that had dried to a stiffness, suggesting they hadn't been worn in years. The desks were child-sized, arranged in rows, their surfaces covered in the accumulated dust of 5 years, but still showing faintly the marks of pencils and jackknives and the restless carved initials of children who didn't know what else to do with their hands during long lessons. He sat in the teacher's chair for a while. He looked out the window at the empty schoolyard. The wooden frame of a swing set still stood there, its rope and seat long gone, but the uprights planted firmly, the crossbar weathered to silver. A marble had rolled into the corner of the windowsill, a plain clay, one amber-colored, resting there with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. He thought about the child who had lost it. He wondered where that child was now. By evening, he had covered most of the main street and had begun to understand the layout of the town's residential area to the east, where a grid of smaller streets held perhaps 30 or 40 homes in varying states of preservation. The sun was dropping behind the western ridge, and the shadows were lengthening quickly, the way they do in canyon country, where the walls catch the light and then the light is gone. He had not yet decided whether to ride back and camp outside town for the night or to stay within the buildings. The decision was made for him by the discovery of the hotel. The Cassidy House Hotel, as the sign above the door still announced, was the finest structure in Hollow Creek. 3 stories, as he had noted. A veranda running the full width of the ground floor with its columns still standing, though one had developed a noticeable lean. Inside, the lobby retained its furnishings in remarkable completeness. A reception desk of dark wood, its pigeonholes still holding room keys on their hooks. Most of them still there, suggesting most rooms had been unoccupied the night everything changed. A pair of upholstered chairs flanking a cold fireplace. A calendar on the wall pinned and faded June 1883. He stopped in front of the calendar. He studied it. June 1883. The summer Orville had mentioned. He couldn't read which date was circled because the ink had faded, but he could see the faint ghost of a circle. A lamp sat on the reception desk. He had brought matches. He trimmed the wick, which was still in good condition despite years of dryness, and lit it. The lamp gave a warm, steady light that pushed the shadows to the corners of the room. He took a room key from the first hook, room 2 on the ground floor, and found the room at the end of the hall. It was small and clean in the way of things that have been undisturbed by human messiness for a long time. A narrow bed with a metal frame, a washstand, a window that looked out onto the side yard where a garden had once been and was now returning to desert, the outline of its borders still visible in the way the plants had arranged themselves. He set his saddlebag on the floor. He placed his notebook on the nightstand. He lay on top of the covers, still dressed, his boots still on, and listened. What you notice first in a town that has been empty for 5 years is not the silence itself. There is always sound in the desert: the wind, the insects at dusk, the distant call of a nighthawk, the occasional yip of a coyote so far away it seems like a memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. What you notice is the quality of the silence between those sounds, the way it has a texture, the way it is not empty but full of the absence of the particular sounds that used to be here. the absence of voices, of footsteps, of doors opening and closing, of horses stamping in their stalls, of children, of pots clanking, axes splitting wood somewhere, a fiddle being played imperfectly by someone who was still learning. None of those sounds were here, and their absence was a presence in itself. Elias lay on the bed and listened to this presence. After a while, he fell asleep. He had not meant to, but travel takes its toll, and the desert night was cool and the quiet was deep, and he drifted without meaning to into a dreamless dark. He was awakened by something. He could not have said what. His eyes opened and he lay still and he listened. The night outside was fully dark. Through the window, he could see stars, an enormous spray of them, the Milky Way laid across the sky like a river. No moon, just stars. And on the street outside his window, a faint light. He got up and went to the window and looked out. He stood there for a long time without breathing very much. Down the main street of Hollow Creek, a lamp was burning in a window. He could see it from where he stood, the golden rectangle of light, steady and unwavering, coming from the window of a building he thought was one of the saloons. He had checked that building that afternoon. He was certain of it. There had been no lamp, no candle, nothing burning. He stood at his window and watched the light for a long time. It did not flicker. It did not go out. It simply burned steady and quiet the way a lamp burns in a house where someone is still awake. He thought about going to investigate. He thought about it for quite a while. He did not go. Not that night. The hour was late, his legs were tired, and the light was so calm, so entirely without menace, that it seemed almost rude to disturb it. He stood at the window until the stars had shifted enough to suggest it was past midnight. Then he went back to the narrow bed and lay down and listened to the quiet. The light was still burning when he finally slept again. In the morning, it was gone. He went to the saloon after breakfast. The hardtack and dried beef he'd brought in his saddlebag, eaten on the hotel veranda in the early morning light, with the canyon walls turning red above him, and a mockingbird running through its entire repertoire, somewhere out of sight. He found the saloon as he had left it. Tables, a bar, a mirror behind the bar mottled with age still reflecting the room back to him in a slightly greenish light. A piano in the corner with its lid down. No lamp, no sign of any lamp having been recently lit. The dust on the windowsill was undisturbed. He stood in the saloon and wrote, "Light in window saloon or nearby approximately midnight steady golden, unaccounted for," in his notebook. Then he went to the church. The church bell moved as he entered the yard, though the morning air was still. He stopped and watched it. Just the faintest suggestion of movement. The bell turning slightly in its housing at the top of the tower, the morning light catching it differently for a moment. No sound. It was too slight a movement for sound. He went inside. The pews were dusty but intact. The simple wooden altar at the front. A Bible open on the lectern, its pages yellowed and cockled with years of damp and dry cycles. The text still legible, the Book of Ruth. He read a few verses and then stepped back. Behind the altar, a small door led into a vestry where the minister had kept his vestments and his records. The vestments were still hanging on their hooks. A white surplice, a black cassock, both of them thick with dust, but otherwise intact, the fabric still holding its shape. On the small desk, a leather-bound record book. He sat down and opened it carefully. It was the church's record of births, deaths, and marriages. He turned to the last pages. The final entry was dated June 11th, 1883. A marriage. Henry Aldous Barker to Margaret Ellen Sayers. The handwriting was careful and practiced. A minister's handwriting, precise and unhurried. The witnesses' names were listed, 4 of them, people from the town, their signatures neat and confident. People who had every reason to believe they would sign more documents before the summer was out. 5 days after this entry, the town was empty. He sat with that for a while. He closed the record book. He sat in the quiet vestry with the smell of old wool and old paper around him, and he thought about Henry Aldous Barker and Margaret Ellen Sayers and what it meant to get married 5 days before everything ended. He hoped they had been happy in those 5 days. He hoped they had gone somewhere good. He spent 3 more hours that morning exploring the residential streets to the east, moving slowly, pausing often, letting the town reveal itself to him at its own pace. He had learned this as a practice over many years of similar work, that you had to be patient with a place, that the places that had something to tell you would tell it if you were quiet enough and still enough to listen. What the houses told him in their way was ordinary life. In one house, a two-story with a good-sized porch and a garden fence, a woman had been making bread. He could tell because the dough bowl was still on the kitchen table, the dough long since gone to nothing but the bowl, and the worn wooden spoon still there, and a flour sack folded neatly by the window. In another house, a man had been mending a piece of tack. The saddle was on a stand in the front room, a leather awl set beside it, a length of waxed thread still threaded through a needle and lying on the floor as though it had just been set down. In a smaller house near the creek bed, he found something that stopped him. A child's bedroom. Narrow bed patchwork quilt, a rag doll sitting against the pillow, with its embroidered eyes looking toward the door. On the floor beside the bed, a pair of small shoes placed very neatly, toes together, heels together, the way a careful child places shoes at bedtime. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not go inside. He went back to the hotel and sat on the veranda with his notebook and wrote for an hour. He wrote descriptions of everything he had seen. He wrote careful factual sentences one after another, because this was the work: to record, not to interpret, not to impose meaning, but to gather the facts and arrange them, and trust that the pattern, if there was one, would eventually become clear. But he found himself writing at the end something that was not a fact. He wrote the shoes were placed with care, and then he sat and looked at what he had written. And then he wrote someone here loved their children. The afternoon brought visitors of a kind, not people. He had not expected people, but signs of continuing life, animal life, the desert doing its slow and patient work. A roadrunner picked its careful way across the main street, stopped to regard him with one bright eye, and moved on. Two horses appeared at the edge of town around 3 in the afternoon. Not horses he had left there, but wild or gone feral ones, their manes tangled, their coats the color of dry grass. They walked the main street without hurry, nosing at doors, drinking from a water trough that had collected enough rainwater to be useful. They regarded him with calm indifference and passed through and were gone. He remembered Orville Pruitt mentioning horses. These might have been descendants of the horses left behind in 1883. Horses that had learned to survive in the canyon country without a livery stable or a hand to feed them. The thought did something to him. There was something in the image. A horse born free because its ancestors had been left without owners, that he couldn't quite arrange into the right words. He added them to his notes. In the late afternoon, he took his horse from the hitching rail and walked it slowly through the residential streets, letting it graze on the dry grass that had grown up between the buildings. He talked to the horse, as he often did when alone, not expecting answers, simply preferring the sound of his own voice to the quality of the silence. He described what he was seeing. He said, "We're in a mining town in Arizona. Somebody used to bake bread in that house. Somebody's children used to run around that yard." The horse found some grass it approved of and lowered its head. The shadows were getting long again. He put the horse in the livery stable. There was still hay in the loft, old but not entirely useless, and made his way back to the hotel. He lit the lamp on the reception desk. He sat in one of the upholstered chairs by the cold fireplace. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote at the top, "What I know about Hollow Creek," and then he wrote below it, "Very little." He looked at that for a while, then he added enough to stay. The first star appeared in the slot of sky visible through the lobby window. Then another. Then, like a dam, giving way the rest of them all at once. The full desert sky opening up in its nightly display, the stars so dense and bright that they cast a faint silver light through the window onto the floor. Elias Hartwell sat in his chair in the empty hotel of an empty town and watched the stars come out. And Hollow Creek settled around him like a question he was only beginning to know how to ask. He stayed 4 more days. He had intended to stay 1, perhaps 2 if the place yielded enough material for his records. But Hollow Creek was not the kind of place that released you quickly. It was the kind of place that had its own pace, its own rhythm, and you either adjusted to it or you left. And the people who left probably told themselves they had not been impressed. Elias had no interest in telling himself that. The mornings were cold now as September deepened. He would wake in the narrow hotel bed with his breath making faint clouds in the air and lie still for a few minutes listening to the canyon before it was light. There was a particular time just before dawn when the coyotes made their last calls of the night. A few tentative yips from the eastern hills answered by something farther away, and then silence, and then the mockingbird again with its inexhaustible catalog. He built a fire in the hotel fireplace on the second morning. He had found a cord of wood stacked behind the livery stable, old and dry and ready to burn. He carried an armload to the lobby and arranged it in the grate with newspaper from a stack he found in the hotel office, the Tucson Citizen, dated April 28, 1883. The paper was brittle and yellowed and came apart at the folds, but it caught well. He sat in the upholstered chair with his boots off and his feet near the warmth and read what he could of the newspaper. A silver strike in the hills north of town had been reported. A church social plan for the following Saturday. A letter to the editor about the quality of the road to Flagstaff. An advertisement for patent medicine promising relief from the aches of mining work. Ordinary life. The ordinary ongoing business of a town that thought it had many more Saturdays ahead of it. He folded the paper and set it aside. He poured water from his canteen into a tin cup and set it near the fire to heat. Outside, the sky was turning from black to deep blue to the particular gray pink that comes just before the sun clears the canyon wall. He thought 400 people. 400 souls, Orville had said. That was a real town, not a camp. A town had a schoolteacher who planned lessons, a minister who performed weddings, a barber who knew every man's face and his family's news and the exact pressure he liked on the razor. 400 people knew each other's names, noticed each other's absences, would have noticed, would have to have noticed if something was happening, unless it happened all at once. Unless the night of June 15th or 16th or whichever night it had been, arrived and then was gone, and with it everyone it had found. He sat with that thought until the fire had burned down to good coals. Then he put his boots on and went to work. The barber shop was on the east side of the main street between the millinery and a vacant lot where something had once stood and burned the charred posts still in the ground. The barber shop's window was intact. Inside the chair, a proper barber's chair, iron frame with a leather seat and headrest manufactured somewhere in the East and freighted out here at considerable expense, was positioned in front of a wall-mounted mirror. The mirror was tarnished at its edges, but still largely clear. The shelf below it held the tools of the trade, a strop, 2 straight razors in their cases, a shaving mug with the dried remains of years-old soap still in it, a row of small bottles, hair tonic, bay rum, a blue one he couldn't identify. The chair was turned toward the mirror at an angle that suggested someone had been sitting in it. He stood in the doorway of the barber shop and looked at the chair for a while. It was the angle. If the chair had been empty and idle, it would have been facing straight ahead or turned all the way to one side. But it was turned the way it gets turned when the barber's working and has just stepped away, partway just enough to get a clear view of what he's doing. He wrote this down. Then he sat in the chair. He looked at himself in the mottled mirror. His face looked back, tired, a little rough, travel-worn, the kind of face that only a long, dusty road could produce. He thought about the men who had sat in this chair before him. He thought about the barber, whose name he might find in the town records if he looked, and the conversations that had happened in this room. The gossip and the news and the opinions and the jokes, all the ordinary social fabric of a small town that conducts half its business at the barber shop and the general store and the church, step after services. He stayed in the chair for a good 10 minutes. Then he got up and went on. The schoolyard gave him the marbles. They were scattered in the dust near the corner of the building, the way marbles always end up when a game is interrupted. Some gathered in the little ring that had been scratched in the dirt, others having rolled a foot or two away, a few having traveled all the way to the building's foundation. There were 7 of them. He crouched and counted without touching them 4 clay ones in various earth tones, 2 glass ones that still caught the light and threw it back in little rainbows, and one, in the center of the ring as though it had won the last shot, a large steely cat's eye. He crouched there for a long time looking at them. He thought about the game being interrupted, someone calling the children inside, dinner, lessons, some errand. Whatever it was that had pulled them away from the game, it hadn't been anything that made them think to pick up their marbles first. They had left them there. In 5 years, no one had come back for them. He wrote 7 marbles, schoolyard northeast corner, game interrupted, clay and glass, 1 large cat's eye in center of ring. Suggest children called away quickly or mid-game pause never resumed. He stood up. He stretched his back. He looked at the marbles one more time. He left them where they were. The letters were the hardest. He found them throughout the residential part of town over the course of that second afternoon. Half-finished letters tucked into various places in various houses, each one its own quiet voice from a morning 5 years past. Most were domestic letters home to parents or siblings in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Missouri, the places these people had come from to try their luck in the mining territories. The handwriting varied from labored and careful to quick and confident, but the content was similar in its texture. The news of the week, the price of things, the health of the children, plans for the future. One stopped him cold. He found it in a house near the north end of the residential grid. A tidy place painted blue once, now the color of a winter sky. The letter was on the kitchen table, 3 pages of it, in a woman's sloped hand, the ink dried to brown, the paper wavy from the moisture cycles of 5 years. He read it carefully, standing at the table, not sitting, as though sitting would have been too much of a presumption. It was written to a sister named Clara in Cincinnati. The writer, he never learned her name from the letter, only that she addressed herself as your Nettie, was describing the summer. The mine had been productive. Her husband had received a promotion of some kind, a senior position in the shift management. The children were growing. The town had gotten a real milliner who had come all the way from Denver. She wrote, "You would not recognize this place from when we first came. It feels permanent now. It feels like a place that is staying." The last line on the 3rd page at the very bottom of the sheet trailed off mid-sentence. "I have been meaning also to tell you about that was all." The rest was blank paper. He stood there with the 3 pages for a long time, reading the last line over and over. Not because he thought he had missed something, just because of the specific gravity of an unfinished sentence. "I have been meaning also to tell you about the—" What? What had she been meaning to tell her sister? Something about the town, maybe. Something that had struck her as worth noting. Something that she would get back to after she dealt with the children or the dinner or whatever had drawn her away from the table. She never got back to it. He set the pages down very carefully, exactly as he had found them. He left the house and stood in the yard for a while, looking up at the sky, which had gone a deep and serious blue in the late afternoon, with no clouds in it and a planet. Jupiter, he thought, already bright in the east. He walked back to the hotel. He did not write in his notebook that evening. He sat in the upholstered chair and watched the fire, and thought about Nettie writing to her sister Clara in Cincinnati, and about all the things we mean to say that we never get around to saying. On the 3rd day, the strange things began. Or rather, he began to notice them. He was not sure which. The piano. He had been in the saloon, the larger of the two, the one with the piano in the corner, cataloging what remained on the shelves and behind the bar. There was still whiskey, technically several bottles so old and evaporated that they held only an inch of dark liquid at the bottom. A bottle of something that had gone to vinegar. He was making a careful inventory, counting and noting the types of goods when he heard it. 3 notes. 4. Not a melody exactly, more like someone trying to remember where a melody begins. The notes were slow and spaced, as though whoever was playing was searching for something. He stood perfectly still and listened. 4 more notes. Then silence. The piano was perhaps 20 feet from him. Its lid was closed. The bench was pushed in. He crossed the room slowly and looked at the keys. The cover was closed and latched. He stood beside it and looked at it. The saloon around him was entirely still. Outside, through the open door, the desert wind moved the dried grass in the empty lot across the street. He opened the piano's lid. The keys looked as they always had. The felt hammers inside, visible through the open frame, were in various states of decay, some intact, some moth-eaten to bare wood. He pressed a single key, middle C roughly. It sounded flat and faintly, but it sounded. He pressed a few more. They were all out of tune, as you'd expect from an instrument left in the dry heat for 5 years. The string for one of the higher keys had snapped at some point and now lay coiled inside the frame. He stood and looked at the piano. He pressed the same keys he thought he had heard from across the room. The sequence sounded different when he played it. Slower, more deliberate, less like searching and more like simple mechanics. He stood for a long time with his hand on the top of the piano, not pressing any keys, just resting his hand there. He wrote, "Piano in main saloon, heard 7 to 8 notes while at far end of room. Possibly whine through loose strings, possibly resonance from footsteps, possibly imagination. Did not sound like either of first 2 options. No explanation currently available." He wrote possibly imagination and underlined it. He thought but did not write that imagination usually sounds different. Imagination sounds like what you want to hear. He had not been thinking about the piano when the notes played. He had been counting whiskey bottles. The clock was harder to dismiss. The town had a clock. Not a church clock, but a civic one mounted on a post at the intersection of the main street and the road that led to the mine. A proper town clock with a painted wooden face and iron hands. He had noted it on his first arrival, but hadn't examined it closely. On his third day returning from the mine road with dirt on his boots and his notebook full of observations about the tunnel's entrance, he stopped in front of the clock. The face read 10 minutes past 3. He checked his pocket watch 20 minutes past 2. He stood there and did the arithmetic and could not make it work any way that made sense. He had set his watch in Tucson 2 days before his arrival. The stagecoach driver there had checked it against the station clock, which was reliable. He wound it every morning without fail. 20 minutes past 2 was the correct time, or close enough. The clock on the post read 10 past 3. That was simply wrong. But then, as he stood looking at it, the minute hand moved. He saw it move. He was looking directly at it, and he saw the hand advance 1 minute with the small clicking progression of a clock's escapement, the familiar mechanical lurch from 1 minute mark to the next. He looked at the clock for a long time. He looked at the mechanism behind the face. The back of the clock housing was open or partly open, and he could see some of the gearwork inside. He knew enough about clocks to know that the springs in there should have wound down years ago. He was not a clockmaker. He could not have said with authority exactly what he was seeing when he looked at the gears, but he could see that they were moving. He wrote town clock intersection of Main and Mine Road, running, incorrect time 1 hour ahead of pocket watch, possible time zone discrepancy. Gears visible through housing. Mechanism appears functional. No apparent explanation for what is maintaining it. He underlined no apparent explanation. He stood there a while longer watching the second hand trace its slow circle. Then he went back to the hotel and built a fire. On the 4th day, he rode to the neighboring ranch country. He had known from Orville's description that Hollow Creek had not been entirely isolated. There were ranches in the wider valley a day's ride out, and the town had done business with them and with the Apache families who moved seasonally through the canyon. These people would have been there in 1883. They might know something. He rode east for most of the morning and found around noon a working cattle operation on a wide flat bench above the creek. A proper ranch with a stone main house and several outbuildings, a well, a vegetable garden, still putting out the last of the summer squash. A woman was hanging washing on a line behind the house. She watched him ride in with the careful attention of someone accustomed to knowing who she could trust from 50 yards away. Her name was Elsbeth Corrigan. She was perhaps 60 with white hair and the kind of face that had been beautiful and was now something better than that. Strong and lined and entirely honest. Her husband had died 2 years back. Her son ran the ranch now. She gave him coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. He asked her what she remembered about Hollow Creek. She was quiet for a long moment. She had the quality he associated with people who live close to the land. A patience with silence, no need to fill it. Then she said, "I remember the morning." She said, "I woke up that morning. Must have been the 16th of June because I remember it was the morning after the Barker wedding. And the canyon was wrong." He asked her what she meant by wrong. She took a long drink of coffee. She said it was too quiet, the way it gets before a bad storm sometimes. But the sky was clear. She had gone outside before sunup to check on the horses, and she had stood in the yard and listened, and something was missing. She had not been able to name it then, and she still couldn't name it now. She said, "I told my husband." We rode in that afternoon. The horses didn't want to go. He asked, "What did you find?" She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. She said, "What you found, just everything left. Breakfast things, washing on the line, children's toys in the yard." She paused. She said the Barker girl, the new bride. She had flowers in a jar on her kitchen table, still fresh, cutting flowers, like she'd just put them there. Elias thought about the date, June 16th, 5 days after the wedding, recorded in the church book. He said, "Did anyone come to investigate officially?" She snorted softly. She said the sheriff came. 3 days later. He walked around for an afternoon and said it was a mine failure, and people had moved on. Said it wasn't the first town to empty out when the ore ran dry. He said, "Was the ore running dry?" Her eyes were steady on him. She said the ore was the best it had ever been. My husband had spoken to the mine manager the week before. They were talking about bringing in more equipment, going deeper. He wrote that in his notebook. She watched him write it. She said they didn't move on Mr. Hartwell. People don't leave their shoes beside the bed when they move on. He looked up. She said I went back a few times that first year. To check. I'd known most of those people. I didn't want them to be just gone without someone checking on things. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. She said I stopped going. It wasn't right to keep going. But I think about them. He thanked her. He left. He rode north through the afternoon. The Apache elder he spoke to the following morning lived differently. A seasonal camp in the western canyon which Elias had found by following a trace of wood smoke. He was an old man named Curly Bear, which was the name a rancher had given him years back, and which he had used so long it had become his own. He spoke good English, learned in the territorial schools, and he regarded Elias with the same unhurried patience as the cattlewoman, though it was a different kind of patience. Older, more considered. He did not want to discuss Hollow Creek directly. He spoke around it the way you speak around a thing you are still deciding how to approach. He said that Canyon has been a strange place for a long time. Before the miners came. He said my grandfather's people knew it. There was something in the ground there. Not a spirit exactly. More like a place where the world was thin. Where things could move through that can't move through everywhere. Elias asked what things. Curly Bear looked at him for a long time. He said time maybe. The way time moves. He said it with the air of a man offering the closest translation he could find for something that had no direct equivalent. He said, we didn't camp in that canyon. We passed through it and we didn't camp in it. Elias asked why. Curly Bear said, because in that canyon you have the feeling that the night before last is happening at the same time as this morning. He paused. He said, I know how that sounds to you. Elias said he didn't think it sounded impossible. The old man studied him again. He said the people from that town, the miners, I don't know where they went. I know they are not in the canyon. The canyon doesn't have them. Whatever the canyon does with time, it doesn't keep people. He said, I think they went somewhere that was waiting for them. I can't tell you more than that because I don't know more. He offered Elias a piece of dried venison for the road. It was a gesture of completion. Not unfriendliness, but the conversation was finished. Elias thanked him and rode back toward Hollow Creek. He rode slowly. He had a great deal to think about. He was back in town before sunset. The western sky was doing extraordinary things, the red deepening to rose, the rose fading to violet, a thin line of orange at the very horizon, where the sun had just gone below the rim. He tied his horse at the livery, gave it the last of the hay he'd found. He walked up the main street toward the hotel. He stopped. In 3 windows, the saloon, a house across the street, and the hotel lobby itself, lamps were burning. Not faintly, not possibly. Burning, clean and bright and golden, the light steady through the glass, unmistakable. He stood in the middle of the street and looked at them for a long time. The lights asked him nothing. They didn't move toward him or away. They were simply there, the way lights are in a house where people live. The way lights look from outside when you're coming home in the dark. He stood there until the night had fully come and the stars had appeared and the lights continued to burn. Then he walked to the hotel, opened the door, and went inside. The lamp on the reception desk was lit. The flame was small and well trimmed. He stood in front of it and looked at it. The oil in the reservoir was recent, not old. He put his finger near the chimney glass and felt the warmth. He sat down in the upholstered chair. He said to the empty room, I don't know what you are. He thought for a moment. He said, but I'm not afraid of you. The lamp burned on. He built a fire in the grate. He made his simple dinner. He wrote for 2 hours in his notebook, filling pages with observations and questions and the things that the rancher woman and the old man had said to him. He wrote without hurrying. He let the fire die down and the night deepen around the building and the lamp on the desk go on glowing. When he finally went to bed, the lamp was still burning. In the morning, it was out again. The reservoir was empty. 5 years' worth of oil somehow burned in a single night. He stood and looked at the empty lamp and thought about that. He thought, I'm going to need more lamp oil. Then he got dressed and went out to explore the rest of Hollow Creek. He found the mining tools on his 5th day. Not the tools in the mine itself, he would go there later. These were surface tools, the ones in use at the ore processing area at the base of the head frame. Picks and shovels and pry bars, their handles smooth from long use, their metal heads spotted with the rust of 5 desert summers, but otherwise intact. A large sorting screen still set up over its wooden frame. a wheelbarrow resting on its handles near the rock dump. He spent an hour among these tools making notes. What struck him was not the tools themselves but their positions. A shovel with its blade buried 2 inches into the earth as though someone had just finished a stroke and was about to lift it. A pick leaning at the exact angle at which someone would leave it if they were setting it down briefly intending to pick it up again. The wheelbarrow handles resting at the precise tilt that suggested it had been set down mid-shift with the expectation of picking it back up in a few minutes. None of these things proved anything. People set down tools all the time. But taken together, they had the quality of a frozen moment, of time stopped mid-gesture, the ordinary, uninterrupted work of an ordinary day, arrested at some precise instant. He wrote ore processing tools at base of headframe, positions consistent with mid-task interruption. No evidence of haste or alarm. Simply stopped. He underlined simply stopped. The horses came back on his 6th day. The 2 he had seen on his first afternoon, the feral ones with the tangled manes. He spotted them from the hotel veranda in the early morning, grazing near the livery stable. He watched them for a long time without moving. They were domestic horses gone feral. Their conformation showed it the heaviness of their legs, the breadth of their chests. They had been working horses once, pulling ore carts or supply wagons, and now they were something else, something that had found its own accommodation with this canyon. They moved without hurry, stopping to nose at the feed troughs that were long empty, then moving on to the patches of dried grass. He thought they didn't leave either. The horses had been left behind in the summer of 1883, and they had stayed. They hadn't tried to find the road south. They hadn't followed whoever had gone. They had stayed in the canyon and learned its seasons, and raised foals that had never known anything else. And 5 years later, their descendants were walking the main street at dawn, as if they had always been the inheritors of this place. He watched them until they drifted back toward the creek bed and were gone. He found the hotel's accounts book on a subsequent afternoon, a thick ledger with marbled covers recording 3 years of operations in a careful hand. He sat at the office desk and read through it slowly. Room rentals, dining room accounts, staff wages. The staff wages interested him most. The hotel had employed in its last operating year a cook named Martha, 2 women who handled laundry and rooms named Rosa and Dolores, a man named Jim who did the heavier work, and a night clerk listed only as W. Greer. These were people who had not made it into the church records or the town directory. They existed in the accounts book and nowhere else he had found. He thought about how records keep certain kinds of people and lose others. The church kept the married, the baptized, the dead. The directory kept the property owners. The accounts ledger kept the employees, briefly in the impersonal notation of wages paid, and then lost them. Martha the cook, Rosa and Dolores, Jim W. Greer at the night desk. He added them to his list. He went and stood in the hotel kitchen for a while, the cold stove, the empty shelves, and tried to give it back its morning, the sounds and the warmth and the smell. Martha with her expertise and her routine, her certainty about what went into the biscuits and in what order. He thought she is here too. They are all here in the walls of this place the way everyone is. The ones in the church records and the ones in the ledgers and the ones who appear nowhere at all, but who nevertheless lived their days here and cooked the food and carried the laundry and stood at the night desk while the building slept around them. He went back to the lobby and sat in his chair. The afternoon light came through the west windows at its long angle, and the lobby was warm for an hour, and he sat in the warmth and thought about all the people he had found in this town, the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable people who had made their lives here and left their marks in the dust and the records and the warm air of a late afternoon. He thought, I will not get all of them. 400 people is too many for one man's research over a few weeks, but I will get as many as I can. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere up the canyon, one clean note and then silence, and then the note again from a different position. He listened to it with the full attention this place had taught him. The coyote moved on. The afternoon light shifted. The town breathed around him. Let the night settle around you now. Let the details of the day grow soft at their edges. You are warm. You are still. Somewhere in the Arizona territory, a man is walking empty streets under a sky so full of stars it barely seems real, and you can walk with him if you like. Slowly, quietly, without any destination that needs to be reached. This is Elias Hartwell's 6th night in Hollow Creek. He has stopped keeping a careful count of the days. Time in this canyon has a way of becoming its own thing. Not rigid, not measured by the clock on the post, which continues to run, which continues to be wrong by amounts that are not consistent, which he has given up trying to explain. He wakes when the light is right and sleeps when the dark says to, and spends the hours between in a kind of alert, attentive quiet that he has not felt in years of traveling. He has found his rhythm here. The mornings are for exploring and recording. The afternoons are for sitting and thinking. And the nights have become something else. The nights belong to Hollow Creek. He had been meaning to walk the full circuit of the town at night for several evenings now, but something had always intervened. Exhaustion, or the comfort of the fire, or the simple fact that his legs had covered too much ground by sunset to want more. But on this sixth night, he ate his dinner early and put on an extra layer and took his lantern and went out. The temperature had dropped into the 40s. His breath was visible. The stars were very bright and very still. No wind tonight, and the canyon walls above the town were dark shapes against the slightly less dark sky, their rims edged in starlight. He began at the south end of town and walked north. The main street was pale with starlight. The buildings on either side were dark rectangles against the sky, their windows reflecting back the stars or simply black. His lantern made a small circle of warmth around him, enough to see the ground, enough to read by if he stopped, but not enough to push back the whole darkness. He liked it that way. He walked slowly. His boots on the packed dirt made their sound, a soft, deliberate cadence, and he listened to it. In a town with 400 people, the sound of footsteps on this street would have been unremarkable, just one thread in a whole fabric of sound. Here his footsteps were the only ones, and they sounded very large in the quiet. He passed the general store, the barber shop. He paused in front of the millinery and looked in through the window. The lantern caught the glass and sent his reflection back to him, ghostly, superimposed on the dark interior and its ranks of hat forms. He had spent an hour in there 2 days ago looking at the hats left on display: a brown felt travel hat, a blue silk afternoon hat with a silk flower, a child's straw hat with a yellow ribbon. The milliner had good taste. She had come all the way from Denver, Nettie had written. She had probably been proud of this shop. He walked on. He heard it when he was abreast of the second saloon, the one he didn't usually go into, smaller than the first, its sign reading Silver Pick Saloon in letters that had mostly survived. Laughter, just a fragment of it. A single burst, as if from a group of people in a room, the sound of people genuinely amused by something. Not a forced laugh, not a polite one, but the real thing. The sound that happens when someone says something unexpectedly right. Then silence. He stopped walking. He stood completely still and listened. The wind was still. No insects. Just the silence. He waited a long time. Then a voice. Or the suggestion of a voice. A man's voice, low, the particular register of someone telling a story to a table of friends. Not words, he couldn't make out words, but the rhythm of it. The cadence of anecdote, the light pauses that let the audience anticipate the slight drop at the end of a sentence. Then another fragment of laughter. 2 people this time, he thought. 3. He walked to the door of the Silver Pick Saloon. He put his hand on the door. He stood there. He thought about what Curly Bear had said the night before last is happening at the same time as this morning. He pushed the door open. The saloon was empty. His lantern swept the room. Tables, chairs, a bar of floor that needed sweeping, a cold fireplace. Nothing. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he stepped inside. He walked to the bar and stood behind it the way the bartender would have stood. He looked out over the room. The tables were just tables. The chairs were pushed in at odd angles the way they end up after a busy evening when no one has bothered to straighten them. He looked at the arrangement of the chairs. 4 chairs at the center table, 2 of them pushed back at the angle that suggests someone sat there for a long time and then stood up rather quickly. He thought this was a full room once. This room held people who were glad to be here, glad to have found a town that felt permanent, glad to have this warm room with these chairs and this bar and whatever was burning in that fireplace. He said quietly, "I can hear you." The room held still. He said, "I know you're here. Not the way I'm here, but here. And I hear you." He stood behind the bar for a long time. He was not frightened. He examined this fact in himself with some interest. He was not a man who had ever been convinced that the world was simple, but he had not spent much time thinking about what persisted after people left. He was finding now that whatever persisted here was not threatening, not cold, not wrong. It was simply present. The way a room is present after the people in it have gone for the night, still holding the shape of their being there. He left the saloon and continued his walk. The fog arrived around midnight. He had heard Orville mention fog and he had not entirely dismissed it, but he had not expected it to behave the way it did. It came from the north down the canyon, moving slowly and low to the ground. He saw it first as a thickening of the air around the church bell tower, a soft blurring of the stars behind it. Then it was at street level, threading between the buildings unhurried. Within 20 minutes, the main street was wrapped in it. Not thick enough to lose his way, but thick enough to turn his lantern light into a sphere of amber glow that didn't reach very far. The fog changed the sound of things. His footsteps became quieter, as though the air had softened. The silence between sounds became a different silence, more textured, more inhabited. He walked through it slowly, turning once in a while to look back at where he had come from. And within the fog, he began to notice things. Not clearly. This is important to say carefully. Not clearly. He was not seeing apparitions, not seeing forms or faces, or the distinct outlines of human beings. He was seeing suggestions, movement at the edge of his lamp's reach that resolved when he turned to look directly into nothing more than the fog and a wall. A window that seemed brighter than the others for a moment, a warmth to it as though lit from inside, and then just a window again. But the sounds were clearer. A child's voice somewhere to his left, high and light, the voice of a child who is running and calling to another child in the particular game-playing register that is always slightly breathless. He turned toward it. Nothing. From somewhere ahead, footsteps. Two sets, he thought. Walking together at the pace of a couple walking home at the end of an evening unhurried. He followed the sound for half a block. It did not get louder or softer. It simply was, and then it wasn't. From the direction of the church, the low, clear tone of the bell. Not the accident of wind this time. A full stroke. Then another, he counted. 4 strokes. His pocket watch said 12:15. He stood in the fog with his lantern in one hand and his notebook in the other, and he listened to Hollow Creek remember itself. He understood standing there, not with his reasoning mind, which was still trying to construct theories and frameworks, but with some deeper level of himself that simply knew things when it was quiet enough, that this was not haunting. That word implied a grief, a complaint, an unresolved demand. This was something else. This was memory, yes, but memory that had been so strong, so full, so present in the lives of the people who'd made it, that it had left an impression in the place itself. The way a hand leaves its warmth in clay. The way a much-loved chair holds the shape of the person who sat in it for years. Hollow Creek remembered. That was all. He walked to the mine road. The Cassidy mine was half a mile north of the main street, up a rocky grade that his boots negotiated carefully in the lamplight. The fog was thinner here above the canyon floor, and he could see the stars again in patches above him. The entrance to the mine was a timber-framed opening in the hillside. The woods still sound the iron tracks that led into the dark, still in place. A head frame loomed above him, the structure that held the hoist mechanism, its silhouette against the stars like a dark cathedral. He stood at the entrance for a while. The air coming out of the mine was cool and still and carried the particular mineral smell of deep stone. A clean smell, not unpleasant, the smell of a place that has been a certain way for a very long time and intends to go on being that way. He held his lantern at the entrance. The light reached perhaps 30 feet into the dark. The tunnel was about 6 feet wide and equally tall, enough for a man to walk upright enough for the ore carts on the tracks to be pushed without difficulty. The walls were shored up with timber frames at regular intervals. The work was good, careful work, the work of miners who intended to be there for years. He stepped inside. He walked slowly, one hand trailing along the timber, shoring the lantern held ahead of him. The sound of his footsteps changed again. Compressed now, the rock walls close on either side, the sound reflecting back to him in a way that made it slightly doubled. His boots saying their word, and then the word again, a fraction of a second later. He walked for perhaps 5 minutes before stopping. The tunnel had widened slightly here into what the miners called a station, a wider space where the tracks branched, where equipment could be stored, where workers could rest and eat their lunches. He could see even now the remnants of that, use a plank bench along one wall, the wood sound and dry in the constant low humidity of deep stone, a collection of candle stubs in a tin holder, A pair of leather gloves, stiff and hard, left on the bench. On the bench, leaning against the wall, a book. He picked it up. It was not the journal he would find. That was deeper in where the mind branched again, in a wooden box nailed to a support timber. This was something simpler, a novel. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The name of someone, he couldn't make it out clearly, penciled on the inside cover. A miner's recreational reading brought underground to fill the lunch break. He held the book for a moment. He thought about a man sitting on this bench with this book reading about the Mississippi River, and a boy on a raft while 40 feet of rock sat above him, and the candles in their tin threw their small, wavering light. He set the book back on the bench. He continued deeper. He found the journal at the place Orville had mentioned, or not Orville exactly, but the story had always included some mention of a journal in the way that legends accumulate particular details that might or might not be true. This one was real. A standard field journal, the kind used by surveyors and engineers, with stiff cardboard covers and ruled pages. It was in the wooden box which was nailed to a support timber at the second branch of the tunnel, and it was wrapped in oilcloth which had kept it in reasonable condition. He brought it back to the station and sat on the plank bench and opened it by lamplight. It belonged to the mine's foreman. He could tell from the first entry, which identified him as J.P. Aldrich Foreman, Cassidy Silver Mine, Hollow Creek, Arizona Territory, January 1883. The entries were professional in character. Notes on the progress of the shafts, the quality of the ore vein, decisions about shoring timber, assessments of equipment needs. The handwriting was clear and businesslike. A man who was good at his work and knew it. He read through the entries. They charted a mine doing well, doing very well. The vein they had found in the previous autumn was proving richer than anyone had predicted, and there were entries in March and April that discussed what additional equipment they would need to go deeper, how they would reinforce the main shaft, what the ore assays were showing. Then in May, a change. Not dramatic, not a single alarming note, but a shift in tone. The entries remained professional, but something beneath the professionalism had altered. There were references to the east shaft, a newer excavation that branched off to the right from the main tunnel. References to something unusual about the east shaft that he didn't describe directly, only obliquely. The word strange appeared 3 times in the May entries. The word deep appeared twice in a context that suggested something other than physical measurement. A June entry noted that 2 of the men had refused to go into the east shaft without saying why. He had reassigned them. The final entry was dated June 13, 1883, 2 days before the town emptied. It read, "East shaft investigation complete. Can confirm my earlier conclusions. Will make my report to the owners by the end of the week. In the meantime, have closed the east shaft and will advise all personnel to avoid it. There is nothing dangerous in the ordinary sense. But there is something there that the men find disturbing, and I confess I find disturbing myself, and a disturbed crew is a safety risk. Will explain in full at the board meeting." And then, in smaller handwriting, as though added as an afterthought, "Cannot quite say what it is. It feels in that shaft as though the time is wrong, as though the morning, in the previous week, and the year before are all present at once. I know how that sounds. I will write a clearer account when I have had more time to think about it." That was the last entry. The sentence ended with a period. The rest of the pages were blank. He sat on the miner's bench and held the journal and read the last entry several more times. "Cannot quite say what it is. It feels in that shaft as though the time is wrong." Curly Bear had said the night before last is happening at the same time as this morning. He closed the journal. He sat in the deep quiet of the mine, with the lantern throwing its warm light and the cool stone all around him, and the darkness beyond the light's reach. He did not go to the east shaft. He had no desire to. This was not fear, or at least not simple fear. It was more that he understood sitting there, that there were questions you could spend your whole life asking without finding the answer, and that this was one of them. The east shaft would give him something, a feeling and experience, more oblique impressions that he couldn't quite translate into the language of straightforward facts. It would not give him an answer because there was no answer that language could hold. He sat there for a long time. He thought about J.P. Aldrich writing his last entry. He thought about the mine board meeting that was never held. He thought about 400 people going about the business of a June evening without knowing that it was their last one. He thought about the wedding 5 days before. He thought about Nettie's unfinished letter to her sister in Cincinnati. He thought about the marbles in the schoolyard, and the shoes beside the bed, and the bread bowl on the kitchen table. He thought these people were here. They were real. They had names and faces and habits and worries and the particular attachments that make a life feel like a life. They were here. Whatever happened to them, wherever they went, they had been here first. He picked up the journal and carried it carefully back up the tunnel and out into the night. Outside, the fog had thinned. The stars were back fully and generously. He stood at the mine entrance and looked up at them and breathed the night air, which was very cold now and very clean. He walked back down the grade to the main street. The lights were burning in the windows again. 3 of them, 4 now. The hotel, the saloon, a house near the church, and one at the far end of the street that he hadn't seen lit before. They burned with a steadiness that had nothing threatening in it, nothing demanding. He walked the length of the main street one more time. He thought, this is what a town looks like when it remembers it was alive. He thought, this is what love looks like when it has nowhere left to go. He stood in the middle of the street with the lit windows all around him and the stars above him and the canyon walls rising on either side, and he felt something he had not expected to feel in an empty town. He felt unmistakably welcome, not in a way he could have defended to a skeptic, not in a way that would have survived a rigorous interrogation, but in the way you feel welcome when you walk into a room where people are glad to see you. Not anything they say, just something in the temperature of the air, the way the space adjusts to your presence. Hollow Creek was glad he was here. He stood in the middle of the street for a long time. Then he went to the hotel and built a fire and sat in the chair and wrote by firelight until very late, writing everything he had seen and heard and felt, writing with the kind of careful precision he always brought to his work, and also with something that was not his usual method, a willingness to write what he actually thought, not just what he could verify. He wrote that the town felt inhabited not by anything frightening, but by the persistence of the lives that had been lived in it. He wrote that the east shaft in the journal suggested the disappearance was not a simple abandonment, but something he could not explain. He wrote that he had walked empty streets and heard laughter and felt welcome. He wrote, I'm going to stay longer. He did not write why. He didn't need to. The fire knew. The lamp knew. The town breathing quietly around him in the small hours of the Arizona night knew. He set down his pen. He listened to the quiet for a while. Then he slept. There was a night midway through his second week when he did not go to bed at all. He had not planned it. He had built his fire in the hotel grate and sat down to write, expecting to go to bed at a reasonable hour, and then simply didn't. The writing carried him forward. The fire burned down and he added more wood, and the writing kept coming, and somewhere past midnight he realized he had not looked up from the page in 3 hours. He set down his pen and looked up. The lobby was very still. The lamp on the reception desk cast its familiar warm light. Outside the windows, the street was dark except for the stars. He got up. He put on his coat. He went outside. The night was very clear and very cold, the temperature in the low 30s, by his estimation, the kind of cold that feels sharp in the nostrils and at the back of the throat. He stood on the hotel veranda and let it wake him fully and looked at the stars. He had grown accustomed to the star field here, the way you grow accustomed to anything extraordinary that you live with long enough. In the first week, it had stopped him every night. The sheer density of it, the Milky Way, a river overhead, the individual stars so bright and distinct that you could understand standing here why people had looked up at this sky and made stories out of it. By the second week, it had become simply the ceiling of his world, always there, always extraordinary, no longer requiring a stop breath. Tonight it required a stop breath again. He stood on the veranda and looked up and felt the particular vertigo that a clear desert sky produces, the sensation of the ground being not quite as solid as it seemed, of tipping slightly toward the sky of the darkness above, being not empty but full in ways that the eye can't entirely assess. He thought Hollow Creek has been under this sky for 20 years. The people here looked up at this same sky. The barber and the school teacher and the cook named Martha and the Barkers on their wedding night. They all looked up at this. He thought the sky doesn't change. The sky is exactly the same sky they saw. Something about that continuity, the same stars, the same arrangement, the same cold and extraordinary dark, felt important in a way he couldn't articulate precisely. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked. He walked the full circuit of the town again as he had done on the night of the fog, but different this time. No fog, no sounds at the edge of hearing, just the clarity of a cold October night, the stars in his breath and his boots on the frozen ground. He walked slowly. He stopped at each building and looked at it in the starlight. He stopped at the school. He stopped at the church. He stopped at each of the saloons and the millinery and the surveyor's office and the barber shop. He stood in front of the house where he had found the drawings pinned to the bedroom wall and looked at it for a long time, and he thought about whoever had lived there. The person who had wanted to see this canyon so badly that they had drawn it over and over, trying different angles, different lights, never quite satisfied coming back again. He thought that person loved this place the way I love this place. He thought maybe that's how I got here. Maybe places draw toward them the people who will love them. Maybe it's less random than it seems. He walked back to the hotel as the sky was beginning to change at its eastern edge. Not light yet, just a faint shift in the quality of the darkness, a suggestion that somewhere below the horizon the world was preparing for morning. He went inside. He sat in his chair. He did not sleep before dawn. He sat and watched the light come very slowly through the windows. When the first bird started, the canyon wren with its descending spiral reliable as a clock, he felt something settle in him. Not resolution, not understanding, just settledness. The settledness of a man who has stayed somewhere long enough to see both ends of the night and has found that both ends are survivable, are more than survivable. He picked up his pen and wrote, "The sky above Hollow Creek is unchanged. The same stars that were here in 1883 are here tonight. The dead and the gone and the vanished. They walked under these same stars. This is a kind of continuity that doesn't depend on explanation." He set down the pen. He watched the sun come up over the canyon rim. October came quietly. The cottonwood trees along the dry creek bed turned yellow all at once the way they do. Not gradually, not leaf by leaf, but as though the whole stand decided on the same morning that it was time. One day they were green, and the next they were gold, and the light in Hollow Creek changed accordingly. The canyon walls caught the yellow light off the leaves and threw it back, and the whole town was for a few weeks bathed in a warm gold that arrived each morning with the sun and lasted until late afternoon when the shadows came down from the canyon rim. Elias had been here 3 weeks now. He had stopped calculating his departure date. He had stopped counting how many notebooks he had filled, though the answer was 3 complete ones and a 4th well underway. He had fallen into the rhythms of Hollow Creek so naturally that he sometimes caught himself thinking of it as home. And then he would sit with that thought for a moment and decide it wasn't quite wrong. He had begun calling the people by name. This had happened gradually, almost without his noticing. He had spent so much time reading through the available documents, church records, the survey company's files in the hotel office, the town ledger from the general store, that he had accumulated a good-sized roll call of the people who had lived here. They were not abstract to him anymore. They were specific. They were individuals. He knew, for instance, that the school teacher had been a woman named Adelaide Cross, unmarried, 31 years old, from Indiana, originally hired by the town school board at a salary of $40 per month. He knew this because the school board's minutes were in a file box in the hotel office, and Adelaide Cross's hiring was the second item in the minutes from February 1882. She had taught here for a year and a half before the town emptied. He thought about her often in the schoolhouse. He thought about her planning her geography lessons, writing the names of territorial capitals on the slate board in that careful chalk. He thought about her knowing her students well enough to know which ones needed patience and which ones needed challenge, the way good teachers always know. He thought about her in some parallel way still there, still standing at that board with the chalk in her hand, still turning to face the children who were still sitting at those small desks. He had stopped finding this thought sad. It had become instead a kind of comfort. He developed habits, routines, the way you do when you live somewhere long enough for your body to want a pattern. Mornings light the fire in the hotel grate, heat water, write in his notebook while the light was still low and the day hadn't quite committed itself. The first hour of morning writing was always the best. The thoughts came without the self-consciousness that arrived later in the day, and the sentences were cleaner for it. Then a walk before breakfast. He had mapped the town thoroughly by now, but the walks were not about mapping anymore. They were about continuity, about arriving each morning and finding everything still there, still holding its shapes against the sky, still doing the patient work of not quite falling down. He said good morning to the buildings, which was a thing he would never have admitted to anyone. He said good morning to the general store and the barber shop and the millinery and the 2 saloons and the church and the school. He did not say it loudly, just a murmur under his breath, the way you might greet a sleeping household. Then breakfast, then the deeper work of the day. The deeper work had changed since his arrival. He had begun sometime in the third week to write about the people themselves rather than the town. Not the mystery of their disappearance. He had largely set that aside, or rather, it had set itself aside, receding to the background where it would stay unresolved forever. He was writing their lives, the ordinary, specific, unremarkable lives they had been living in the summer of 1883. He wrote about Adelaide Cross and her geography lessons. He wrote about the barber, whose name he had found in the general store ledger was Thomas Fitch, and his chair and his bottles of bay rum and his strop. He wrote about the woman named Nettie who had been writing to her sister in Cincinnati about how permanent the town was beginning to feel. He wrote about the baker whose name was Hans Gerber and who had arrived from Munich 11 years before and had found his way eventually to this Arizona canyon where the air was dry enough to keep flour without mildewing. The town ledger recorded his accounts faithfully: flour, sugar, salt, lard, deliveries of baked goods to various establishments, a steady business. Hans Gerber had his receipts in order. Hans Gerber was, as far as the ledger showed, a careful and prosperous man. He wrote about the Barker wedding. Henry and Margaret married June 11th by the minister whose name was David Ellsworth and who had come from a parish in Kansas. He spent an afternoon trying to reconstruct the wedding from the evidence the town had left. The church records had the service. The hotel records, what remained of them, suggested a supper had been held in the hotel dining room because a page from the hotel's account book recorded charges for a private party of 16 people on that date. 16 people at a wedding supper. He thought about them all. Henry and Margaret at the head of the table, the guests arranged around them, the food and the wine, and the particular warmth of a celebration that feels like a beginning. 5 days after the wedding, the town was gone. He thought, I hope the wine was good. I hope the supper was everything a supper can be. I hope they danced if there was room for it, and that everyone laughed at the right moments, and that Margaret and Henry went to sleep that night feeling entirely certain of their good fortune. He wrote all of this in his notebook. He wrote it slowly in his best handwriting, the way you write things that matter. There was an afternoon in the third week when he found something he hadn't expected. He had been working through the residential streets, methodically checking buildings he hadn't fully examined, and he came to a house at the very east end of the residential grid. A small house, the smallest on the street, set back from the road by a few extra feet, as though it had tried to give itself a little more privacy. The door was locked, which was unusual. Every other door in Hollow Creek had been left unlocked, unlatched, in most cases standing open. This one was locked. He stood on the porch for a while and thought about that. Then he found in the end that one of the windows had a loose catch and he was able to get it open. He went in through the window feeling slightly undignified and lit the lamp he'd started carrying with him during the day. Inside a small sitting room, tidier than most. A kitchen barely large enough to turn around in. And off the kitchen, a single bedroom. On the wall of the bedroom, a collection. Pinned to the wall with small tacks covering most of the space above the narrow bed were drawings. Dozens of them done on whatever paper had been available. The backs of envelopes, pages torn from ledgers, proper drawing paper in a few cases. All of them drawings of the canyon, the creek bed, the hills, the way the light hit the mine headframe at different hours, the cottonwood trees, cactus drawn with careful botanical attention, the main street at different angles and in different weathers, judging by the different quality of shadow and light. One person sustained attention to this place. Years of it, probably. He stood in front of the wall of drawings for a long time. He couldn't tell anything about the hand that had made them beyond the fact that it was a good one. Practiced attentive to detail with an eye for the way things were actually built rather than the way they were supposed to look. Some of these drawings were genuinely beautiful. He didn't know whose house this was. He didn't find any documents with a name. He checked the desk in the sitting room, a careful search moving things as little as possible, and found only a few miscellaneous papers, an ink bottle, and a pen with a worn nib. He went back to the bedroom and stood in front of the wall of drawings. He thought someone loved this place. Not abstractly, not in the way people love a hometown from a distance or love a landscape because it is dramatic, but with the specific patient daily love that makes you want to draw a thing over and over. The love that is also a form of attention. The love that says, I see you and I want to see you better, and I am willing to come back tomorrow and look again. He stood there for a long time. He did not unhook a single drawing. He went back out through the window and latched it as best he could behind him and sat on the porch step for a while in the afternoon light, which was golden. Now very golden, the cottonwoods doing their seasonal best. He wrote in his notebook, Person Unknown House, at East End of Residential Grid Collection of landscape drawings sustained and skilled. Canyon subjects would estimate years of work. Whoever they were, they saw this place. Then he wrote without quite meaning to, we are all trying to say something about the places that hold us. He read that back. He thought about crossing it out. He left it. The lights continued every night. He had stopped trying to investigate them. In the first week, he had hurried to check every lit window, making sure it was real, touching the glass, trying to find the source. Now he simply noted them in passing the way you note the moon or the weather. 3 windows tonight, including the church. Lamp in hotel lobby again, different oil reservoir this time. Light at the piano window approximately 2 hours after dark. He had found that the piano played more often than he had initially realized. It was not always audible from the hotel. He had to be in the saloon or nearby, and it was not always the same time of night. But it happened. Short sequences of notes. Not a complete song, never a complete song, always something partial exploratory, as though someone were just sitting down and beginning to think about what to play. He had taken to leaving the saloon door open in the evenings. On the 14th night, he brought his chair from the hotel lobby to the saloon and sat in it with his notebook and his lamp, and worked there while the piano played. He did not look at the piano while it played. He looked at his notebook. He thought this was correct, that looking directly would be the wrong kind of attention, the kind that disrupts things. The notes came and went. He wrote, the fire he'd made in the saloon's grate burned down. The night passed the way a good night passes, with the sense that time is doing its work properly, moving at the right speed for once. Near midnight, the piano played something sustained. 15 or 20 notes, slow and deliberate, the melody of something he almost recognized but couldn't name. A hymn maybe, or a parlor song. The key had enough of a signature that he could almost identify the piece. Almost. He wrote in his notebook, piano sustained sequence, approximately 15 to 20 notes. Near midnight, not identifiable but organized. Not random, a piece or the beginning of one. He underlined not random. He had a conversation around this time with himself. He conducted it in his notebook the way he sometimes did when he needed to think something through. He wrote, I came here to document a disappearance, to record an unexplained event, to add Hollow Creek to the list of places I have studied and described. He wrote, I am no longer doing that. He wrote, I am no longer primarily interested in what happened to these people. I have accepted that I will not know what happened to them. I have accepted that no one will know. He wrote, I am interested in who they were. He stared at that sentence. Then he wrote, I think that is actually the better work. He thought about this for a long time, sitting in the saloon with his notebook in his hands, and the fire low and the town quiet around him. He thought about all the histories he had read, the official ones, the ones that explained events and accounted for causes and effects and movements of populations. The histories that reduced people to data points that cared about the disappearance of a town only as a problem to be solved. Those histories were useful, he had used them himself, but they left something out. What they left out was what it felt like to be in the barber's chair, what it felt like to write a letter to your sister and have the thought go unfinished, what it felt like to pin your drawings to a wall and wake up every morning with them there, all the things you had seen. That was what was not in the histories. And it was, he thought, the thing that actually mattered, the thing that persisted, the thing he could hear in the piano notes and see in the lit windows. Not the mystery of the disappearance, but the reality of the presence that had come before it. He wrote, I am going to write about these people, not a history of what happened, but a record of who they were. He wrote Adelaide Cross, Thomas Fitch, Hans Gerber, Henry and Margaret Barker, Nettie, last name unknown, writer of unfinished letters, J.P. Aldrich Foreman, the painter of drawings unknown. He added more names as he recalled them from the records he had read. He listed them. There were 23 names on the list when he stopped, and that was a fraction of the 400. But 23 was a start. He looked at the list for a long time. He said to the room and to all the things in it that were not quite visible, I am going to try to remember you properly. The fire gave a soft pop. The night breathed through the canyon. He went back to Elsbeth Corrigan's ranch. He rode out on a Tuesday, or what he thought was Tuesday, though he had lost precise track of the days and didn't mind, and found her at the same table with the same careful attention to who was riding into her yard. She brought out coffee without being asked. He showed her his notebook. He showed her the list of names. He asked, "Do you remember any of these people?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she took the notebook from him and sat with it, holding it in her capable hands, looking at the list. She said, "Thomas Fitch." She remembered him. Said he was a careful barber and a decent man who had a habit of giving credit to the miners who came up short at the end of the month. She said Adelaide Cross. She remembered her too, had spoken to her once at a gathering, a serious young woman who was genuinely enthusiastic about teaching, which was not always a given. She said Hans Gerber's bread was the finest in the territory. This surprised him. He asked how she knew. She said we came in for supplies on Saturdays sometimes. He always had something extra to sell at the counter, something he'd made that morning. A roll, a small loaf. Whatever it was good. He wrote down Hans Gerber, Saturday mornings, something extra at the counter. She continued through the list. She knew some names and not others. She added small details, the kind that never make it into official records. She said of a man named Clarence Webb, who had been listed in the ledger as a carpenter, he built his wife a porch swing because she complained about the heat. She'd seen it every time they drove past, said it was a good-looking piece of work. He wrote Clarence Webb, carpenter, built a porch swing for his wife against the heat. He spent 2 hours at her table. By the time he rode back, his notebook was dense with new writing, specific and human and irreplaceable. He thought this is what an archive should be. He thought this is why I do this work. There was an evening in the middle of October when he sat on the hotel veranda as the light changed and found himself in a state of mind he hadn't visited in years. Not happiness exactly, but something close to its quieter cousin. A settledness, a sense that things were where they should be, that he was where he should be. The canyon walls were turning from red to purple in the fading light. The cottonwoods glowed. A single hawk circled at the top of the canyon very high, its wings barely moving. The sky above was going green at the horizon, deepening to blue directly overhead. One star had appeared already, the first one, always the brightest, holding its place, while the rest of them gathered their courage. He thought about home. He had a room in Tucson that he paid rent on by the month, and it had a good desk and a good lamp and a window that faced west, and he supposed it qualified as home in the practical sense. But he was aware, sitting on this veranda in the fading light, that the feeling he was feeling right now, this settledness, was not something he had felt in that room. He had felt it here, in a town that was empty, in a place that had no right to make anyone feel settled, in a ghost town in a canyon in the Arizona territory, in the company of memories and old documents and lit windows and piano notes. He thought, I suppose that's the thing about places. They choose you as much as you choose them. He thought, I suppose Hollow Creek chose me. He sat on the veranda for a long time as the night arrived. The stars came out in their usual, overwhelming profusion. The coyotes began their nightly conversation with each other across the hills. A nighthawk cut its angular path across the sky, catching insects in the darkening air. In the hotel lobby behind him, a lamp came on. He didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He just sat there with the night around him and the stars above him and the warm light at his back, and felt as simply and completely as a man can feel anything that he was not alone. He made a second visit to the locked house with the drawings. He had been thinking about the unknown artist for a week now, and the thinking had become a kind of mild obsession. Not consuming, not distressing, but present. The way a question sits in you when you know the answer exists somewhere, if only you look in the right place. He went through the house more carefully the second time. He opened the desk drawer fully and removed each item and examined it. A collection of worn pencils, their tips rounded from use. A sharpening knife blade thin from repeated use. 3 small cakes of compressed charcoal wrapped in paper. Art supplies. A working artist's ordinary tools. He found at the very back of the drawer a receipt. It was folded into quarters and had been there long enough to take on the shape of its folding. He opened it carefully. It was a receipt from a supplier in San Francisco, a supply company, the name partly illegible now from age and handling, for the following 6 drawing boards, 24 sheets of heavy drawing paper, a box of graphite pencils, 4 blocks of compressed charcoal. Delivered to Mr. C. Bellamy, Hollow Creek, Arizona territory. He stood in the little sitting room holding the receipt. Mr. C. Bellamy, a name. A name was not nothing. A name was, in fact, quite a lot. He went through the rest of the house with the name in his head and found 2 more things. A small framed drawing hung in the kitchen. Not a canyon drawing, but a portrait of a woman done with the same careful observational hand half-finished, as though the artist had been interrupted before the lower portion was complete. The woman had dark eyes and an expression of patient amusement. She looked like someone who had learned to find her husband's artistic habits charming rather than inconvenient. And on a shelf in the kitchen, a letter, addressed and sealed and ready to mail but never mailed. He did not open it. He would not open a sealed private letter. But the address on the front was legible, and he read it, Mrs. Florence Bellamy, 14 Chestnut Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He stood with the letter in his hands. Florence, that was the woman in the portrait almost certainly. The wife who was in Philadelphia, visiting or living there while her husband worked in the territories or returned there for some practical reason. The wife to whom the letter had been written and sealed and made ready and never sent. He set the letter back on the shelf very carefully in exactly the position it had been. He went back to the bedroom and stood again in front of the drawings on the wall. C. Bellamy, a man who had come to this canyon and found something worth drawing over and over and over again in all its moods and weathers. A man who had been trying to describe this place to himself in the only language he had for it. A man with a wife in Philadelphia and a sealed letter on a shelf. He thought about Mr. C. Bellamy looking out his kitchen window at the canyon walls and feeling, what the particular pull of a place that has decided it has something to say to you. The complicated feeling of a life divided between here and there. The need to draw a thing that words couldn't quite hold. He added to his list C. Bellamy, landscape artist, Philadelphia connection, drew the canyon. Then he went outside and sat on the porch step and looked at the canyon walls himself for a while. He could see now why someone had needed to draw them. The way the light shifted across the red rock face throughout the day, hour by hour the shadows moving the color deepening or brightening, was not a static thing. Every hour was a different thing to look at. The canyon was not a single view, but a continuous experience, and drawing it was an attempt to hold it still long enough to say yes. This is what I mean when I say I know this place. He sat on the porch step until the shadows had moved significantly, and then he got up and walked back toward the hotel. He passed the clock at the Main Street intersection. It was running as it always was. He had stopped trying to determine what it was telling him. He simply noted this afternoon that it was running. He thought time works differently here. He thought maybe that is the whole of the explanation if an explanation is what you need. He did not need one. He walked back to the hotel and added 3 pages to his notebook about C. Bellamy, about the drawings, about the sealed letter, and the woman named Florence in Philadelphia who had never received it. He wrote those pages with care. He chose each word deliberately. He wanted the sentences to do justice to what he had found, not just the facts of it, but the weight of it. The sealed letter, the incomplete portrait, the drawings covering a whole wall. He wrote, some people say what they need to say in words. Some people say it in other ways. C. Bellamy drew his love for this canyon onto every scrap of paper he could find and pinned it to his bedroom wall and never quite finished saying it. He thought that was as human a thing as he had ever read. The morning he decided to leave, he woke before dawn to find frost. Just a light frost, the kind that comes in late October when the desert night has been particularly clear, and still the temperature dropping to that exact point where moisture turns to crystal on every surface. He saw it from the hotel window when he rose in the gray hour before sunrise, a thin silver coat on every exposed surface. The hitching rail, the sign above the general store, the ground of the main street, the individual grains of packed dirt catching the first faint light and glinting with it, the whole street transformed briefly into something that had never been an ordinary street at all. He stood at the window for a long time. He thought it his time. He had known it was coming. October had been deepening steadily, and he was aware in a practical way that winter in the canyon country could close off the road he'd arrived on, that his horse needed proper care, that this town's surviving hay could not provide indefinitely, that he had been away from the ordinary world for long enough that people might be beginning to wonder. He had letters to write, work to deliver, a life that was not ultimately lived in a hotel room in an empty town in Arizona, however much a part of him wished it could be. He had enough material for 3 books, possibly 4. He had filled 5 notebooks and started a 6th. He had the list of 23 names that would serve as the skeleton of the record he intended to write. The real work, the one about who these people had been. He had Adelaide Cross and Thomas Fitch and Hans Gerber and Henry and Margaret Barker and Nettie's unfinished letter in J.P. Aldrich's final entry in the wall of drawings in the locked house. He had enough. He knew he had enough. He also knew, as clearly as he had ever known anything, that leaving would be one of the harder things he had done. He spent that last day in a way that he hadn't planned but that felt, once he was doing it, entirely right. He walked. Not to investigate, not to record, not to make notes. He had his notebook in his pocket from habit, but he barely opened it. He walked through the town the way you walk through a place you love when you know you are leaving, slowly touching things, looking at them for a long time, committing the specific quality of the light to a part of the memory that doesn't rely on language. He started at the south end of town and moved north. He paused in front of each building on the main street and looked at it, really looked at it the way he hadn't always looked in the early days, when he was so busy cataloging that he forgot to simply see. The general store with its false front and its weathered sign and its scales that still balanced. He had spent hours in there in his first weeks inventorying, and now he stood in front of it and let it be itself for a while. The barbershop with Thomas Fitch's chair still turned to the mirror at its working angle. He went inside one more time and sat in the chair again briefly, just long enough to look at himself in the tarnished mirror and think a lot of men sat here. Real men with their particular faces and their concerns of the week, and their necks tipped back trusting a stranger with a razor. Real men, real necks. He got up and went on. He stood in front of the millinery and thought about the woman from Denver who had chosen this canyon as the place to build her trade. He didn't know her name. He had not found it in any of the records. The millinery shop had no accounts at the general store, only a listing in the town directory, which he had found in the hotel office and which was dated 1882, under millinery and dry goods Mrs. Beaumont. He had not had time to find anything more. He thought Mrs. Beaumont from Denver. I did not find your story. I'm sorry. I will try harder when I write it up. He went to the school. Adelaide Cross's slate board still held its geography lesson in its faded chalk. He stood in front of it for a long time. He thought about her. He thought about what it took to be an unmarried woman from Indiana teaching school in a mining town in the Arizona Territory in 1882. The particular combination of courage and practicality and idealism that such a choice required. He thought she must have been an interesting person. He thought he would have liked to know her. He picked up a piece of chalk from the tray at the bottom of the board. He held it for a moment. Then he put it back. The board was hers. He had no business writing on it. He sat at the teacher's desk for a while, the small chair with the worn armrests, the desk with its drawer that held an empty inkwell and a penknife and a ruler. He looked at the rows of student desks, the afternoon light coming in through the windows at its October angle, lower than it had been when he arrived in September, warmer in color. He said quietly, "Thank you." He said it the way you say thank you when you mean it completely, when the words are not a social form, but a genuine attempt to express something that is difficult to express. Gratitude for what a place has given you, for what it has asked of you, for the way it has changed the shape of your thinking. He wasn't sure who or what he was saying it to. That was all right. He left the school and walked to the church. The bell tower was accessible from inside through a narrow stair at the back of the vestry. He had noticed the stair in his first week and not gone up. Now he did. It was a tight climb, a proper spiral stair, the treads worn in the center from years of use, the plaster walls close on either side. At the top, a small platform with a railing, and above it the bell housing with the great bronze bell. He stood on the platform and looked out. From here he could see the whole of Hollow Creek, the full length of the main street, the residential streets spreading out to the east, the dry creek bed curving south, the mine head frame on the hill to the north. And beyond all of it, the canyon walls rising on three sides, and above them, the open sky. The cottonwoods along the creek were at their fullest yellow now, the color almost impossibly warm, the late afternoon light deepening it further. He could see the whole town from here in a way he had never been able to see it from the ground. The way it had been planned and built, the logic of the streets, the relationship between the residential areas and the commercial strip, the mine road climbing the grade to the north. It made sense from up here. It made the sense of a town built by people who intended to stay. A town that had looked from this elevation permanent. He stood on the bell tower platform for a long time. The wind was coming gently from the north, not cold enough to be uncomfortable, just present. He could feel it on his face coming off the higher country. The bell swayed slightly beside him. He thought about David Ellsworth, the minister climbing these stairs on Sunday mornings to ring the call to service. He thought about the congregation below, moving across the open ground toward the church dressed in their Sunday clothes, the men with their hats in their hands. He thought about the sound of that bell ringing out across the canyon, the way it would have rung from wall to wall, the echo making it seem larger than it was. He thought how many Sunday mornings did this bell call these people to this church, in this canyon, under this sky? He reached out and put his hand on the bell. It was cold against his palm. The bronze was textured with age and with the small scratches and marks that any working bell accumulates. He could feel, or imagined he could feel, the faint vibration of it, the potential of the sound it contained waiting. He took his hand away. He climbed back down the stairs. He spent that evening in the hotel lobby in his chair doing the things a man does when he is preparing to leave a place. He went through his saddlebag and made sure everything was in order. He checked his horse's gear, which he had brought into the lobby because he was packing it in the morning and preferred to have it at hand. He went through his notebooks one more time, reading certain passages, satisfying himself that the record was complete enough to work from. He ate his last dinner in the hotel dining room. He had begun using the dining room in the second week, finding he preferred a table to the chair, though the kitchen remained closed and his meals were still the hardtack and dried goods he'd brought. He ate slowly. He looked around the dining room, at the tables with their chairs at the windows that gave onto the street, at the sideboard along the wall with its empty serving dishes. He thought about the wedding supper that had been held in this room. Henry and Margaret Barker and their 16 guests, the food that Hans Gerber's bakery had probably contributed, the particular warmth of a celebration at the beginning of summer in a town that felt permanent with the best parts of the year ahead. He hoped it had been a good evening. He believed it had been. He washed his dishes in the kitchen. He banked the fire in the lobby grate. He took one last look at the reception desk with its key hooks, most of them still holding keys, and the lamp on the desk. He said goodnight. He went to his room. He lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling for a while. Outside the window, the stars were doing their usual thing, filling the sky so completely that the darkness between them seemed like an afterthought. He could see the Milky Way from where he lay through the window, and he watched it for a while. He did not expect to sleep easily. He had said this to himself in the afternoon, preparing for a wakeful night. He was wrong. He fell asleep with the ease of a man whose conscience is clear, whose work is done, whose body knows exactly what it has accomplished, and is satisfied. He slept deeply and without dreams. He woke before dawn, not startled, not suddenly. He simply came up from sleep smoothly and found himself awake, the room dark, the cold of the small hours in the air. He lay still for a moment and then got up. He dressed, he pulled on his coat. He put his boots on, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark. He picked up his saddlebag and his last notebook and his lantern. He went to the window and looked out. The main street of Hollow Creek lay in the pre-dawn dark, the frost from the day before just beginning to reform on the surfaces, the stars very bright, the canyon walls dark shapes against the sky. Everything was still. And then one by one, the lights came on. He watched it happen. The hotel lobby window from within, a warm glow appearing behind the glass, the lamp on the desk that he had not lit and that had no oil in it, and that came to life as though on its own authority. Then the saloon, the large one, the one with the piano, a light in its window. Then the house across the street, the blue house with the porch. Then the millinery, then the church, then the school. Window after window after window, moving up the main street, the whole town coming alive in its soft golden light. He stood at his room window and watched this happen and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I know." He picked up his things. He went down the hall and through the lobby where the lamp on the desk burned steadily and warmly, and out through the front door of the Cassidy House Hotel for the last time. The main street was transformed. Every building that had ever had intact windows was lit. The light was warm and steady and the same quality in every window. The lamplight quality, the golden quality, the quality of a town at night where people are still awake. He stood on the hotel veranda and looked down the length of the street. He could hear it now. The same things he had heard in the fog and the night walks. The sounds at the edge of hearing the sounds that were not quite sounds but were also not quite imaginations. Laughter somewhere, a piano playing something complete and unhurried, a door opening or the sound of a door opening. Footsteps on the porch of the building 2 down from the hotel, very quiet, 2 feet on wood. And the smell, He noticed the smell. Wood smoke. Baking bread impossible, but the smell of it moving down the street in the pre-dawn air, warm and yeasty and entirely real. Coffee, maybe. Something his body recognized as morning, as a morning when people are up and the stoves are lit. He stood on the veranda and looked at it all and breathed it in. He thought, I am going to spend the rest of my working life trying to write you. He thought, I don't know if I will succeed. He thought, I am going to try. He went to the livery stable and got his horse. The horse was calm. It moved with him easily, without the reluctance it had sometimes shown in the early days, when Elias could not quite explain even to himself why an animal might be wary in this place. Perhaps the horse had settled too over the weeks. Perhaps it had found its own accommodation with Hollow Creek. He led it out into the street. The lights were all still burning. He mounted. He sat in the saddle in the middle of the main street of Hollow Creek, Arizona territory, with the stars above him and the canyon walls around him and the light of an entire town at his back, and he was still for a moment. Just still. He did not try to name what he felt. Some things are better left unnamed. He turned the horse south toward the canyon exit and the road to Tucson. He rode slowly. The town was behind him. The lit windows, the sounds at the edge of hearing, the smell of bread and wood smoke and morning. He felt it receding as he rode, not with a sharp edge, but gradually, the way a dream recedes when the waking world takes hold. He did not look back. Not because he couldn't, not because it would have broken anything, but because he had thought about this on his last night. Looking back as a way of saying it's over, and he did not believe it was over. He believed it was an interruption. He believed he would carry this place with him, and that the carrying would be its own form of return, and that return is not made by looking back over your shoulder, but by holding something in you and letting it live there. He rode through the canyon mouth. He rode out into the wider desert. The morning light was beginning to show behind the mountains to the east. Just a thinning of the dark, a suggestion that somewhere over there the sun was working its way toward the horizon. The sky was still mostly dark overhead, still full of stars, but with that slight adjustment beginning the first sign of the day coming. He rode through the sage. He rode past the dry creek bed where he had first found the trace of Hollow Creek and followed it north. He looked at the creek bed as he passed. In the early spring, he knew now this creek ran hard. He had seen the high water marks on its banks, the deposits of sand, the evidence of volume. He thought, in the spring this runs. In the spring, Hollow Creek, the waterway fills up and moves. The thought pleased him. He rode on. When the sun was up, fully up, the light flat and golden across the desert floor, he stopped his horse on a rise of ground and turned to look back. He could not see the town. The canyon had swallowed it. The rim of the canyon was just a line against the sky, ordinary looking, giving nothing away. He looked at it for a while. He said to the distance, to the canyon, to whatever was in it, and of it I will write you down. I will put your people in pages and keep them there. He said you were real. I know you were real. I will do my best to say so. He turned back to the road and rode south. He wrote 6 books about Hollow Creek. The first one, the account of his time there, the observations and the unexplained events, and the conversations with Elsbeth Corrigan and Curly Bear. He wrote in a boarding house in Tucson over the course of one winter. It was his best written book in the opinion of the few who read it. He was never entirely satisfied with it. He thought he had not gotten the quality of the silence right, that no written description of a silence can quite reproduce the texture of the actual one. The second book was the record of the people. Adelaide Cross, Thomas Fitch, Hans Gerber, Henry and Margaret Barker, Nettie with the unfinished letter, whose full name he eventually found in a census record, Annette Clara Webb, wife of Clarence the carpenter, who had built the porch swing. He was enormously pleased to find her name. He felt when he wrote her full name at the top of her chapter that he had returned something to her. The third book was about the mine and J.P. Aldrich and the East Shaft. He was careful with this book. He wrote what he knew and what he didn't know in equal measure, and made very clear which was which. He made no conclusions. He let the evidence stand as it was. The journal entries, the foreman's careful handwriting, the final entry that trailed off into uncertainty. He let the reader sit with it the same way he had sat with it on the plank bench in the mine. The fourth and fifth and sixth books were smaller, collections of what he called fragments gathered from other abandoned settlements in the territory, each one a different variation on the question of what places remember and what they forget, and how the lives that have been lived somewhere leave their traces in the air, in the walls, and the dust. He dedicated all 6 books to Hollow Creek, Arizona Territory, 1888. He never went back. He didn't need to. The town was with him. It was in his notebooks and in his books and in the particular quality of attention he brought to every place he went after. A quality of attention that said, this matters, these people matter. The ordinary life that is happening in this place at this moment is worth looking at with care, because there will come a time when someone who loves a place will want to know that it was looked at carefully, that someone came and stayed and wrote it down. He thought about this sometimes in the evenings in whichever boarding house or ranch house or rented room he happened to be occupying. He thought, I was the one who came to Hollow Creek. I was the one who was there. I don't know why I was the one, but I was, and I did what I could with it, and that will have to be enough. He thought it was enough. He thought, in fact, it was more than enough. It was one of the better things he had done. And now the story's ending. Can you feel it? The way a story ends when it's a good one, not with a door slamming, not with a declaration, but with a gradual quieting. The way a fire settles into coals. The way the last light leaves the sky by degrees. Somewhere in the Arizona Territory, a canyon holds its silence. The buildings of Hollow Creek stand in the moonlight, upright and patient. Their windows dark, now dark, the way windows are dark when the night is late and the town is resting. The main street stretches between them, the packed dirt pale under the stars, the hitching rails still standing, the sign above the general store still saying the name of this place in letters that have faded to ash gray. The cottonwoods along the creek are bare now, their leaves long since fallen, and turned to earth, the branches making their winter patterns against the sky. The creek bed is dry. The mine headframe stands on its hill in the moonlight. The church bell sways in the slow night wind. Somewhere beneath the desert, silver waits in the dark. Somewhere above the canyon, the stars are turning slowly in their ancient courses, the way they have turned since before anyone was here to name them, the way they will keep turning long after every name is forgotten. And in the hotel on the main street, in a room at the end of the hall, there is a narrow bed with a metal frame. The mattress holds the impression of a man who slept there once and slept deeply. No one disturbs it. The town watches over it. The town watches over everything it has ever held. All the people who came here looking for something, all the children who played in this yard, all the letters that were started and never finished, all the bread that was baked and eaten, all the conversations that happened in these rooms, all the ordinary days that were at the time just ordinary days, and that are now, somehow impossibly, still here. Not gone. Held. Kept in the stone and the wood and the dry desert air, the way a canyon keeps the echo of a voice long after the voice has moved on. Hollow Creek is asleep. Hollow Creek is dreaming. And if you close your eyes right now, if you let your breath come slow and easy, if you let your body be heavy and warm and safe, you might find that the dream is open to you. Not to visit, not to investigate, just to walk through once slowly with no particular destination, in the way you walk through certain dreams that have the quality of arriving somewhere you've always meant to go. The main street is cool and pale under the stars. The lamps are out, but the stars are enough. You can see the church at the end of the street and the school and the 2 saloons with their wide doors. You can hear the creek bed in the west dry, but still suggesting the sound of water. The memory of water, the promise of water in the spring. Someone has left a lamp on in the hotel. It burns low and warm behind the lobby window. There is no one you need to find here, nothing you need to understand, no mystery you are required to solve. You can just be here, for a moment, in the quiet. Let the town breathe around you. Let the desert stars do their slow work overhead. Let the night be what it is, long and dark and full of an ancient peace that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the fact that the world is very old and very large, and knows how to be still in ways that we sometimes forget. You are safe. You are warm. You are here. Hollow Creek holds you the way it holds everything, without judgment, without urgency, without any demand except the simplest one, that you remember for just a moment that places are real, that people were real, that the ordinary lives lived in ordinary rooms on ordinary days are worth something more than we usually give them. And then, let it go. Let the town recede the way it recedes at dawn, Slowly, the details softening the outlines, blurring the pale street, fading into the particular gray that comes before the light. Let the church bell sound its faint note and then be quiet. Let the stars thin out. Let the morning find you where you are in your warm bed, in your own life with the ordinary goodness of that life around you. Hollow Creek will be there. It will be there in the morning and next week and next year, and 100 years from now, the canyon holding it in its ancient silence. The building's patient, the stars above returning each night without fail. Some places do not need to be understood to matter. They only need to be remembered. And you have been here. You remember. Sleep now. Sleep well. The night is long and the stars are many, and there is nothing here to fear. Only the quiet, only the dark. Only the old and patient world breathing slowly under the stars. Good night.